Hello, friends. We are in the American Revolution Road to Independence Reader. Today we're going to be reading Chapter 3, Part 2. We're going to be starting on page 24. But before we start, I want to do a brief review of what we learned in the last reading at the beginning of this chapter. So the British government was putting more and more taxes onto the colonists, and the colonists were getting angrier and angrier. The colonists decided that there probably was going to be a war, so they started getting ready. And the British government knew that they were getting ready, so the British government sent soldiers to the colonies in hopes of confiscating, that means to take by force, their weapons, and also finding the biggest troublemakers and arresting them. That would be Samuel Adams and John Hancock. And in April of 1775, the British tried to get some weapons, and approximately 700 British soldiers marched out of Boston on April 18th. However, the colonists were watching them. Page 24, The Night Rider. One of the men keeping an eye on the British was Paul Revere. He had heard that the British soldiers were getting ready to march out of Concord. He knew there were only two ways to get to Concord from Boston. One was to march there on foot. The other was to cross the Charles River in boats and then march the rest of the way. It was not possible to tell which way the British would go until they set out. Revere came up with a clever plan. He told a friend to hang lanterns in the belfry of the North Church in Boston. The belfry is the place at the top of the church where the bells are. If the soldiers left Boston on foot, Revere's comrade was to hang one lantern. If they set out in boats, he was to hang two lanterns. So why do you think it was important for Paul Revere and the others to know which way the British were going to Concord?
They needed to know which route they would take to Concord in order to warn the colonists before the British arrived.
Okay, so which way were let's keep going. Which way were the British soldiers coming to Concord from Boston? We don't know that yet, so let's keep reading. On the night of April 18th, 1775, Revere's friend ran up to the belfry and hung two lanterns. So that means what? They were coming by
boat.
Across the Charles River. Two lanterns means boats. Then Revere and several other patriots jumped into action. Revere got into a rowboat and rowed across the Charles River, right past the British warship. Once he made it across, he jumped onto a horse and set off along the same road the soldiers would soon be taking. Paul Revere and other riders, including William Dawes and Samuel Prescott, rode through the night to awaken the sleeping colonists. Paul Revere, well known for the popular cry, "The British are coming! The British are coming!" never actually spoke those words.
Lies.
Let alone yelled them into the darkness. Today, historians believe it is more likely he quietly warned colonists, "The regulars are coming. The regulars are coming out." Paul Revere never made it to Concord that night, but he did ride to Lexington to warn Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who were wanted by the British and hiding there. Because of Revere and the other riders, people who lived along the road knew the British soldiers were headed toward Concord. Hundreds of Minutemen grabbed their guns and prepared to defend their homeland. Let's take a look at the image. This painting of Paul Revere's ride was created more than 100 years after the night of April 18th, 1775. The scene depicted is not an entirely accurate account of what happened. However, it does convey the tension and drama of the events that took place that night. Look at the horse. And look at the stance of the men. Look at him talking to someone through a window. This is an artist's depiction of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. We now know this image is not entirely historically accurate. What evidence in the text suggests that the image may not be historically accurate?
Paul Revere quietly warned colonists the British soldiers were coming. He was not the only rider.
All right, so if he's yelling to a person in a window, that's not going to be quiet. And in this picture, if he's the only one riding to tell people, and we know that's not true. Other people were riding to tell the colonists as well.
They probably split up, though.
Maybe they did. Okay, let's turn the page. And this page, page 26, is titled, The Shot Heard Round the World. It was April 19th, 1775. In Lexington, a town on the road to Concord, 80 militiamen lined up in formation. They had their guns with them, but they were not planning to fire on the redcoats. Remember, the redcoats are from Great Britain. After all, the war had not been declared. Still, they knew there was a chance fighting might break out, and they wanted to be ready if it did. As the British approached, John Parker, the leader of the Lexington militia, told his men, "Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. And if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." So he's saying, stand, be strong, don't fire your gun unless someone fires at you. A British officer told the armed men to go home. According to one report, he shouted, "Lay down your arms, you rebels!" However, as the militiamen were turning to go, a shot rang out. Who fired the first shot? Even today, nobody knows for sure. The British soldiers thought the militiamen fired it. However, Parker and his men said later that they did not. The shot may have been fired by someone who was not part of Parker's militia. He may have been firing into the air to sound an alarm. In any case, the soldiers thought they were under attack. They fired a volley. That means they fired back. And in a matter of seconds, guns were flashing and smoking on both sides. Okay? So, people now call the event described in this paragraph as the shot heard round the world. Why do you think this event is called that?
Everyone in the world must have heard about what happened because it is what started the Revolutionary War.
Okay, shot heard round the world probably wasn't heard around the world, but it was the shot that started the Revolutionary War. So, here we go. Next page, page 28. 7 members of the militia were killed in Lexington that day, and 9 more were wounded. On the other side, only 1 British soldier was wounded. Next, the British soldiers marched on to Concord. They searched Concord and found a few cannons and some musket balls. By this time, word of the fighting was spreading rapidly. Hundreds of men made their way to Concord, ready to fight. One troop of militiamen met the regulars on the outskirts of Concord at North Bridge. The British fired. The militiamen fired back. Soon the British commander decided to march his troops back to Boston. However, as the British soldiers made their way back, militiamen shot at them. The militiamen hid behind trees and stone walls. They fired on the British soldiers, 1 or 2 at a time. By the time the British made it back to Boston that night, 73 soldiers had been killed, and another 174 had been wounded. As for the colonists, 49 had died, and 39 had been wounded. The colonists had stood up to the British, and the British had failed to capture Samuel Adams and John Hancock. There was no going back. The Revolutionary War had begun.
Woohoo!
I don't know if they said that, but it had begun. All right, so let's take a look at the box titled Georgia Stays Home.
Georgia was the only colony that did not send representatives to the First Continental Congress that met in Philadelphia in 1774. The Georgians also opposed British trade regulations. Many hesitated to join the revolutionary movement that emerged in the colonies. Many Georgians believed that they had prospered under royal rule.
Okay, so many Georgians did not want to get involved with the revolution because they had done well under the king's rule. All right, next page. Two very important patriots, and these two men have been mentioned a couple of times in the reading. So the first one is Samuel Adams. In 1765, Samuel Adams was elected to the Massachusetts Colony Assembly and became the leader of opposition to the British government. As a delegate to the First and Second Continental Congress, Adams fought for colonial independence. Though Harvard educated, Adams was not part of the social elite who typically held government positions at the time. Friends, that means that he had a college education, but his family was not like one of the rich, powerful families that usually ran a government. Several of Adams's acquaintances, people he knew, helped to give him a gentlemanly appearance, more befitting a political leader of the time. For his first trip to Philadelphia, one friend provided him with financial assistance, gave him money, and another gave him an outfit to wear to the meeting. So, he showed up at the meeting looking like he was rich and well off, but really he wasn't. His friends were just helping him. The other man we've heard mentioned a couple of times is John Hancock. Let's hear about John Hancock.
John Hancock's name tops the list of signatures on the Declaration of Independence. His prominent signature is familiar to anyone who has seen an image of that document. John Hancock was a wealthy Boston merchant and patriot leader of the American Revolution. Following the Boston Massacre in 1770, John Hancock was one of the committee members chosen to go to the governor to demand the removal of British troops from the city. At the funeral of Crispus Attucks and other victims, Hancock delivered an address that led to an order for his arrest.
So, John Hancock was a wealthy Boston merchant. He was a patriot leader of the American Revolution. He demanded the removal of British troops from Boston, and a speech he gave at Crispus Attucks' funeral led to an order for his arrest. Whatever he said in that speech at that funeral did not make the British happy, and they wanted him arrested. So let's take a look. We've got the big question. What was our big question?
What was the Revolutionary War, and what were the causes that led to it?
Okay, so Britain had implemented a series of new laws, the Intolerable Acts. The First Continental Congress drafted a list of complaints and grievances against Britain. Many people in Massachusetts organized militias, stockpiled guns, and prepared to fight. British soldiers were sent to confiscate weapons from the Sons of Liberty. Someone, we don't know who, fired a shot that prompted shooting on both sides. It's known as the shot heard round the world, and thus the Revolutionary War had started. Thanks for hanging out with us, friends.